does a woman's right to bodily integrity trump a fetus's right to life? The question of when life begins is different than if the fetus has any right to the woman's body at all. That's why pro-choicers can concede that life may begin at conception, but still assert that since the fetus doesn't have a right to the woman's body, abortion is permissible. This is what the philosopher Judith Thomson argues in what's probably the most influential analogy made in defense of abortion, the violinist argument. So take this scenario. Imagine you've been kidnapped by the Society of Music Lovers, and you find that you're strapped to a famous violinist who requires the use of your organs in order to live due to a fatal disease. This is analogous to having an unwanted pregnancy. The violinist is like a fetus. With that, the main question is, do you have the right to unplug yourself from the violinist, in so doing causing his death, or do you have the moral responsibility to remain strapped to the violinist until he's recovered? In abortion terms, do you have the right to abort the fetus or not? Most people think that you have the right to unplug yourself from the violinist, even if it causes his death, because it is pretty unreasonable to force someone to remain strapped into the violinist, especially if they didn't give their consent to do so. The main idea is that you can't be forced to use your own body to save the violinist, and so you can't be forced to use your own body to save a fetus. This intuition shows us that we never have the responsibility to save another person's life if it's at the cost of our own bodily integrity. If it's unreasonable to support the violinist who's an adult person, then it should be unreasonable to force someone to support something that has a lesser interest in life, like a fetus. Thomson herself claims that no one is entitled to the use of another's body. And so in the case of pregnancy and childbirth, a mother sacrificing her body for the fetus is not actually a moral obligation, but an act of good Samaritanism. The difference between the two being that a moral obligation is a responsibility, like paying taxes, whereas being a good Samaritan is like giving food to the homeless. It's not something you're obligated to do, but it's nice of them to do so. Pregnancy and childbirth is not morally required of anybody to do, but it is very nice of them to do so. Even in cases where people require the bare minimum use of another's body, the person is not obligated to sacrifice their body to do so. This may be quote-unquote indecent, but it's never immoral. The example she gives is if all you needed to save your life from a fatal disease is if Henry Fonda, the famous actor, came and touched your forehead with his cool hand, then Henry Fonda isn't obligated at all to touch your forehead with his cool hand, even if he was walking by your hospital room and all he had to do was walk in, touch your forehead, and leave. It would be indecent of him not to do so because all he had to do was walk in, touch your forehead, and leave. But it's not immoral because you still don't have the right to use his body. Therefore, the right to bodily integrity is a fundamental right that not even the right to life can overcome. In response to Thomson's violinist argument, pro-lifers have offered the following rebuttals. The first is the killing versus letting die rebuttal. The cause of death is different between the violinist versus the fetus. In the first case, you're letting the violinist die versus killing the fetus, and killing is inherently worse than letting die. The violinist already had a fatal disease, and if you unplug yourself from the violinist, you're just letting that fatal disease run its natural course, and so you're letting the violinist die. The violinist already had a pre-existing condition that the fetus did not. Naturally, the fetus is supposed to use the mother's body in order to grow and develop into a fully realized human being. So when you abort the fetus, you're removing it from its natural circumstances and therefore killing it. The fetus had no fatal pre-existing condition like the violinist did. So this cause of death argument relies on this pre-existing condition clause, which clearly the violinist has with the fatal disease. But I actually do believe the fetus has a fatal pre-existing condition. That condition being its inability to survive on its own. This means that abortion isn't actually killing, it's letting the fetus die due to its inability to survive on its own, similar to how unplugging from the violinist is letting him die due to his fatal disease. With this logic of pre-existing conditions, why can't it be said that, say, a child left to die in the cold didn't die due to child abuse, but died because of its inability to survive on its own? This is clearly a case of child neglect, but by the convoluted logic of pre-existing conditions, it is in the child's nature to die. And so leaving the child out in the cold is just letting die and not killing. But the thing is, if you look further and further back into the cause of someone's death, you'll ultimately go back to the cause of someone's death is that they existed in the first place. And at that point, we can't have any discussion about the ethics of killing at all if we say that the cause of this person's death is because they lived. The violinist didn't die due to his fatal disease, it's because he was born in the first place. The fetus didn't die due to abortion, but it's because it existed in the first place. And the child didn't die from child abuse, it's because he lived in the first place. Now, this falls into a weird nihilistic pipeline, which we have to reject 100% if we want to have any discussion about killing whatsoever. So let's take a look at the second argument, the consent argument. In the violinist story, you are a victim of a crime. The Society of Music Lovers kidnapped you and forced you to remain strapped into the violinist. This isn't just analogous to unwanted pregnancy, but more so rape incest situations where you're a victim of a crime. Since the analogy lines up better with rape incest situations, if it's permissible to unplug yourself from the violinist, then it's only permissible to abort fetuses due to rape and incest. I think this also follows our intuitions with how horrible it is to think about that sort of situation, so it just makes sense if abortion due to rape incest is permissible. But this means that the violinist analogy doesn't apply to the vast majority of abortions due to consensual intercourse, allowing a space to make it impermissible. For the most part, pro-lifers concede that abortion due to rape incest is actually okay. If you consent to sex, then you consent to pregnancy, and if you don't consent to sex, then you don't consent to pregnancy. You are simply responsible for the consequences of your own actions. And since sexual intercourse has the consequence of conceiving a child, then people who have sex knowingly cause a child to be conceived. So the woman who consented to sex and caused the fetus to be conceived is also morally responsible for birthing that fetus. Argument goes like this. 1. Sexual intercourse has the foreseeable consequence of conceiving a child. 2. Consenting to sexual intercourse means consenting to any foreseeable consequence that may occur. And 3. A woman who consents to sexual intercourse automatically consents to pregnancy and childbirth. However, does number 2's premise make sense? By doing said action, are we responsible for any outcome that occurs from that action? I don't think we're always responsible for the consequences of our own actions. Say if I walk out in the middle of the night and then I get mugged, am I responsible for that? No, it's the mugger's fault. I mean, I probably shouldn't be walking out in the middle of the night, who knows where, but it's still the mugger's fault. They bear the legal responsibility of the crime. This is just to say that every action has its own risks and every action has its own consequences, but how do we know when we are responsible for those consequences? Well, first, there's a couple of clear cases where we know the responsibility lies. Say when a crime is done to you, you don't bear the responsibility of the consequences. When I get mugged, it's the mugger that gets punished and I get compensated. In the case of the violinist, you don't bear responsibility for the violinist, so you're morally allowed to unplug yourself. And finally, it applies to rape incest cases. Another case where you don't bear the responsibility is in natural disasters. You know, if lightning strikes your house, you don't bear the responsibility of recovering. You got homeowner's insurance for that. And the same thing applies to other natural disasters. You can't be responsible for something that random. Even if you chose to live in a disaster-prone area, you don't bear the responsibility when natural disasters strike your stuff. And pro-choicers argue that this applies to abortion too. Having a child is like a natural disaster. It's an undesirable natural consequence of sex. And women aren't responsible to bear that child in the same way that we're not financially responsible to repair our property when lightning strikes it or an earthquake hits. It's simply one of the consequences of owning a house or having sex. But pro-lifers can counter by claiming that consensual intercourse sparked the chain of events that caused the pregnancy to occur. And in the case of natural disasters, those are just completely random, or for the most part, just uncontrollable. But in the case of pregnancy, those are totally controllable in the cases of consensual intercourse. And so pregnancy is different than natural disasters. So what then is pregnancy from consensual intercourse more equivalent to? First is informed consent. NDAs, contracts, terms and conditions. You have willingly signed a contract to do this and that or not do this and that. You are legally obligated to abide by those conditions. This is clearly not the case in consensual intercourse, because rarely do people, if ever, sign contracts before going through with that activity. But still, people can actually consent without having informed, written consent. They can actually consent silently. In the case of tacit consent, people just know the rules of engagement silently. Say if I gamble my money at a casino, I'm not obligated to that money back. If I made a bad investment, I'm not obligated to that money back. If I persistently yell at a public library, I'm gonna get kicked out. In these cases, there are unspoken agreements made. At one point or another, we might have been told straight up what those rules were, but eventually, everyone just knows, and we just go on living. Everyone is responsible to uphold these social customs and contracts, and to break them is taboo. So for pro-lifers, even if consensual intercourse isn't a form of informed consent, it could still be tacit consent. And so the woman still bears some responsibility for pregnancy and childbirth. However, the philosopher David Boone-Vale believes that abortion is still permissible, even with tacit consent. In his defense of abortion, he uses the social custom of tipping as an analogy for abortion. Say you're at a restaurant and you willingly put money on the table, and you decided that, you're just gonna leave it there for now, but before you leave, you're gonna pick it back up and take it with you. You end up forgetting, so it looks like you just tipped the waiter or waitress. A while later, you realize that you left it, and then you head back to the restaurant to retrieve your money. So, do you have the right to your money back? It looks like you've tacitly consented to tip the waiter or waitress, but Boone-Vale believes that you do have the right to your money back, and so you haven't tacitly consented to tipping. It might be an awkward situation to get that money back and talk about why you left the money on the table. It just looks stupid, but it's not immoral. If you didn't tacitly consent to tipping, then it could also be the case that you didn't tacitly consent to pregnancy through consensual intercourse. And so the tacit consent argument falls flat. Just because there is an unspoken social contract in play doesn't mean that everyone has consented to that social contract. I don't believe this makes a case to upend all social customs, but it does show that it's not a crime to go back on things. Now, the last form of consent that pro-lifers can use as a rebuttal is intentional/negligent harm. Say you were texting and driving and you caused an accident. You are responsible for the person's recovery, whoever you hit. You have caused a state of affairs in which someone's life has been harmed and they require your help. In this case, the state can force you to support others through financial means. And in the case of abortion, you have caused a state of affairs in which the fetus is in need of your help to survive. The state can force you to support that fetus through financial means. However, what the state can't do is force you to sacrifice your bodily integrity, even if you're the cause of that person's state of affairs. This is what pro-lifers have to answer. Is it ever the case that someone is morally obligated to use their body and sacrifice their bodily integrity to save another person's life, even in the case that they caused that state of affairs to occur for the other person, and even at another point, if you are the only person available to save that person? Say hypothetically you caused someone's kidney to fail, and you were the only person in the world that could save this person by donating your kidney. Are you morally obligated to give your kidney away to this person to save them? even if you were the cause of it, and if you're the only person who could save them? The answer is no. There's actually never a case when someone is morally obligated to sacrifice their bodily integrity in order to save another person's life, even if they were the cause of their dependency, and even if they're the only person that could save them. We have criminals that harm other people. Like, we don't force those criminals to sacrifice their organs, their blood, or whatever, and sacrifice their bodily integrity in order to save that person that they harm. We don't do that to criminals, and we don't do that to anyone. Now, we do have other forms of punishment that are morally acceptable, jail, prison, and financial consequences, but never do we force someone to sacrifice their bodily integrity. And so that means that negligent consent is not enough to overcome bodily integrity, and so abortion is permissible in this case. Aside from the cases of consent, we could also take a look at other hypotheticals to see if bodily integrity can ever be overcome. Consider that there is an unconscious man in the middle of the road, and there are toxic fumes around this guy that, if breathed in, will cause 2 years of excruciating pain for you. If you choose to save this man, you'll inhale those toxic fumes and you'll be in pain for 2 years. But if you don't choose to save this man, the only way through the road is to run him over. You have two options. The first, you can save the man, but at a harm to you. Or two, you can spare yourself from the pain, but kill the man. In this case, most people would agree that, well, you don't have a moral obligation to save the man because the harm to yourself is too great of a consequence. And so killing the unconscious man is permissible. What if instead, the consequence of inhaling the toxic fumes was not 2 years of excruciating pain, but like an inconvenient 5-minute nose itch? And in this case, most people would actually say that you do have a moral responsibility to save that unconscious man. We've actually overcome bodily integrity. And this kind of goes counter to Judith Thompson's Henry Fonda case, where Henry Fonda does have a moral responsibility because it's such a bare minimum effort for him to go and touch your forehead. But the thing is, anything in between these two extreme cases, people aren't going to find much agreement. It's only on the extreme ends of this hypothetical that pro-lifers and pro-choicers can find agreement. 2 years of excruciating pain is way too much for anyone to go through. A 5-minute nose itch is obviously very little, and you are morally obligated to save that unconscious man on the road because it would require bare minimum effort and also bare minimum harm is done to you. But in the case of pregnancy and childbirth, it falls somewhere in the middle of these two extremes. And so it's much harder for people to agree on the level of harm pregnancy and childbirth is. Because for pro-choicers, they'd say that it's way too much harm done to the mother, and so they're not obligated to save the fetus. Whereas pro-lifers may see that pregnancy and childbirth is like a minor inconvenience. Whatever it is, it's all totally objective, and there's not really a right and wrong answer here. Everyone's tolerance for pain is just different. So I'd say that there is one agreement that pro-choicers and pro-lifers can see eye to eye on, is that there is a threshold of harm that makes abortion permissible. But the problem lies in that that threshold is different for everyone. It's completely subjective, and everyone is equally as valid. And also, one of the problems with this is that someone's gonna get hurt. It's either you or it's the unconscious man. And in abortion, it's either the mother or the fetus. For the fetus to develop and grow, it must harm the mother. To alleviate the mother's harm, they have to kill the fetus. There's no getting out of harm. But because there is an agreement for the threshold of harm, and it's totally subjective, I believe the woman always reserves the right to bodily integrity, and so killing the fetus to save herself is morally permissible. I think we've reached the end of the rope of pro-life rebuttals here, and the last argument that can be made is an appeal to parental responsibility. I'd say that both pro-choicers and pro-lifers agree that parents have a social and moral obligation to take care of their child. Parent-child relationships are fundamental to our society, and parents that don't uphold that are called like deadbeats, they're abusive, neglectful. Killing your own child is morally impermissible because it breaks that parent-child bond that's so important to our society. And so, ultimately, abortion is impermissible. But I don't believe that parental responsibility can overcome bodily integrity still. It's much in the same vein as negligent and intentional harm. People aren't obligated to use their own body to support another person. The state can obligate parents to financially and socially support their child, but they can't force them to use their body to support them at all. Say a parent isn't expected to give their kidney away to their child in order to save them. The state can't enforce that in the same way that they can't enforce that onto criminals, as I mentioned before. Therefore, if parental responsibility isn't strong enough to overcome bodily integrity, then it's not strong enough to force a mother to bear their child. And so abortion is permissible. And now, since we've gone through all the pro-life rebuttals, from parental responsibility, tacit consent, informed consent, intentional negligent harm, natural disasters, victims of a crime, there is not a single case in which bodily rights can be overcome. The state can never force you to sacrifice your bodily integrity to do anything, even if it means the fetus will die if the mother withdraws bodily support. Going back to the violinist argument, ultimately, we are allowed to unplug ourselves. Remaining plugged into the violinist is, as Judith Thompson said, an act of good Samaritanism rather than a moral obligation. And so I, like pretty much all of you, are going to unplug from the violinist. And sadly, he will die. I think pro-choicers are right that the right to one's body is a fundamental right, but it comes with some consequences that even pro-choicers kind of disagree with. Since bodily integrity can never be overcome, then the mother is allowed to abort the fetus at any stage of pregnancy and childbirth, as long as it does some amount of bodily harm to her. This means that killing a third trimester fetus is just as permissible as killing a first trimester fetus. This comes as a problem to some of the more middle ground pro-choicers who believe that a 24-week ban is justified, because it's actually not, because bodily rights cannot be overcome at any stage of pregnancy. And it's also the case that the woman is more justified in killing the fetus at later stages in pregnancy because the fetus is bearing more of a burden onto her. But killing a third trimester fetus on the face of it is pretty bad because it's pretty much a newborn infant. I mean, this is the essence of the abortion dilemma. It's either your full-on bodily rights that you can kill the fetus at any point during pregnancy up until the moment of birth, or you're either full-on pro-life and say that the fetus's life and right to life is stronger than the woman's bodily right in every case. It's no one or the other. You can't appease to a middle ground. And when states, countries try to do middle ground policies, it seems never to work for anybody. There's never any agreement. It's always a constant back and forth. And so what's the solution for the abortion issue? I think the only way to figure this out is to analyze pro-choice and pro-life policies and see which ones decrease the most amount of abortions and simply implement those policies. This is an analysis that I'll do in my third and final video, Abortion in the Real World. So I hope you learned something today, and I'll see you next time.